welcome. My name is James Voorhees, and I'm the Chief Curator here at the Bas, and so thank you, everyone, for being here. It's really great to see so many familiar faces, and also thanks so much Hernan and Isabelle for doing this. I really appreciate it. We all do. Before we get going, I do want to just take a moment to thank the Knight Foundation for their support of our Curator Culture series. We're really grateful for their support on that, as well as the upcoming multi-year initiative called the Knight New Media Initiative, which is supported also by the Knight Foundation. And also just to thank our colleagues in public events, as well as exhibitions, as well as development, and everyone here at the museum for helping us put together today's talk. And lastly, but not least, certainly thank all the lenders to Hernan's exhibition. We really appreciate their support of the exhibition. So today's program with Isabelle and Hernan is organized on the occasion of the exhibition Hernan Bas, the Conceptualist. In the gallery upstairs are more than 30 paintings of imagined conceptual artists. Hernan's paintings prompt important questions about the role of the medium of painting historically to represent someone or something. And ostensibly, the paintings are portraits, but Hernan has turned the focus on conceptual art, a field of art born from the very rejection of representation associated with the material art object, and instead embracing materiality and ephemerality. The conceptual artists in his paintings do not have names. Each painting instead is numbered, accompanied by rather insightful information about their work. The paintings are really compelling. They are complicated, I think, in the best of ways. They invite us to look a little longer and think a little more about what exactly is happening and what is Hernan representing in the works. And comparatively, the esteemed art historian and critic Isabelle Graw, who is with us here today, has spent a career in art and criticism, writing and thinking and teaching us to look a little longer and think a little more, especially about painting and the history of that medium. Isabelle is one of the foremost art critics in the world. She launched the art journal Texas der Kunst in Cologne in 1990, which remains a leading outlet for writing on art, a publication impacting a generation of artists, writers, and critics. Based in Berlin, she is professor of art theory and art history at the 𝙏𝙚𝙚 School in Frankfurt, where she co-founded the Institute of Art Criticism. Her many publications, which are too numerous to list here, include The Love of Painting, Genealogy of a Success Medium, High Price, Art Between the Market and Celebrity Culture, Thinking Through Painting, Reflexivity and Agency Beyond the Canvas, and in 2020, she published In Another World, a book merging memoir and social criticism. And then just last year, the book On the Benefits of Friendship, which takes the form of an intimate diary reflecting on the purposes and struggles of friendship in the art world. So we are so grateful to Isabelle for your attention to this also for your attention to the forthcoming monograph on Hernan, with an incredible 6,000-word contribution of a conversation called Not of This World, a conversation between Hernan Bas and Isabelle Graw. And that publication will be released in June as part of this exhibition. Hernan, I feel, needs very little introduction in this context, but to briefly refresh everyone, Hernan graduated from the New World School of Art here in Miami. His recent solo exhibitions include the Youth Museum in Shanghai, Space K in Seoul, Miami's Rubel Museum, and the Center of Contemporary Art at Colby College, among many others. His work is in numerous public collections, including the Brooklyn Museum, Art Gallery of Ontario, the Hirshhorn, MoMA, Museum of Fine Arts Houston, Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Whitney, Yale, SF MoMA, and the list goes on. And I just have to say that it has been such a pleasure to work with Hernan on this exhibition and the forthcoming publication, and to be in his orbit during the last year or more. So thank you. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Hernan Bas and Isabelle Graw.
Yeah, thank you so much, James, for this kind and generous introduction, and thank you also Claudia, Sylvia, and everybody else from the BAS to have brought me here to Miami. It's my second trip to Miami. I really love it. And thank you, Hernan, for agreeing to continue our conversation that indeed, as James pointed out, already happened once as a kind of rehearsal for what we will do now for the catalog. Today we want to look more deeply at your exhibition called The Conceptualists. And I think it's maybe important to start asking, like, who are these conceptualists that are painted? Because it's evidently a kind of typology of fictive conceptual practices that you have reunited through these paintings. And it's kind of unclear to me whether they mock a certain conceptual tendency to render everything plausible, to use a certain jargon such as performance-based, which is a formula that you use a lot in the titles. So you seem to kind of, you know, on the one hand, the paintings seem to make fun of conceptualism, but then they also remind us of conceptual art as something that painting in particular should look at. Painting in particular should take insights from conceptual art, and considering that many young painters nowadays pretend that conceptual art never happened, I think this is a very important proposition. And you know, while slightly mocking these fictive practices that you made up but that resonate with conceptual art, you also seem to take them very seriously, because these paintings are very carefully executed. They're very visibly very labor intensive. You know, there are milk bottles painted in a pop art manner. There's silver foil painted in a way that is very visibly very labor intensive. There are many corners in these paintings where you see that this is a labor of love. So my question is, what's your relationship to the conceptualists? Are you mocking them? Are you investing them with care and love and attention? Or is it both?
I think ultimately it's both. I think conceptual art in general is the easiest thing to make fun of. When people think of a way to make fun of art, they immediately go to conceptual art because it's the easiest target. It's Marina Abramovich like standing there. You know, it's too easy a target sometimes. So I didn't want to make fun of conceptual art because in reality, it's the works that I love personally tend to be conceptual as opposed to traditional painting, which people might find surprising, but a lot of my influences actually come from conceptual work. So I didn't want to make fun of it, and I think that's been a misconception. But there is humor in the work, which I think is incredibly important because, A, I think people should be able to laugh at art, and it shouldn't always be so serious at the end of the day. But also, for me, the characters, it all sort of started from the series of paintings I was making during the pandemic when it first started. And I realized that a lot of the characters were, I guess, up to doing really strange things, like the same way a lot of people during the pandemic were, like baking bread for the first time in their lives when they've never touched a loaf of bread in their entire, like all these weird things, like, you know, accumulating like, you know, 20 cats, then you're living with like 50 cat boxes and stuff. So these weird things.
Meditating nonstop.
Yeah, just ridiculous things that I thought these characters were doing all these weird things in these paintings that I was making at the time, similar to what was happening in the real world. But I thought it was a way to give them a sort of cover was to call them conceptual artists. If you call someone a conceptual artist, they can get up to anything and do anything as weird as possible, but as long as you call them a conceptual artist, you can't make fun of them anymore. And so in a way, that was my way of giving these characters a blank slate or a free pass, basically, like a hall pass to get away with anything. So that's sort of how I approached the whole series, and it also was a way for me to think about making conceptual art and have it not be me actually making it. So it's not my work, it's that guy's work, you know? So it was a way for me to distance myself, but also explore these kind of silly ideas, and some of them are sillier than others, some are pretty good conceptual art, I think. But,
and
but not all of it's the best art in the world that these guys are making, but it didn't really matter at the end of the day. It was just a way for me to sort of have a doppelganger, I guess, as well. Like.
Yeah, and the doppelganger also makes it clear toward the end of the show when we see the self-portrait in quotation marks, because it's you and not you that gets depicted there. You make it very clear that you are part of these guys. You are part of these weird, you are also a weird artist who kind of follows these crazy interests. You do not claim a position that is above them, but you make it very, very clear toward the end of the show that you're implicated in these practices as well. And there's something else I was interested in when looking more closely at what these conceptual artists do. I mean, they're all these practices that get depicted are somewhat tending toward failure. You know, they're ephemeral. There's the artist who chews gum every waking hour of the day, or there's the one who carves sculptures in the sand, or there's the one who sends emails to everyone in his zip code. So these kind of activities are not really going to be market successful.
Right.
And at the same time, and they're also slightly pathetic, and doomed to get no recognition, but you provide recognition for them. And as a painter, you provide market success for them. You kind of compensate for that failure by dragging these invented practice into a realm of market success, which is the realm of lots of painting. As we know, the painting on canvas is traditionally an art form that is kind of, how can I say, easier to speculate on, and that is very popular in the commercial market sphere and also in the auction sphere. So there's that tension again between flirting with the failure, but also making sure that all these crazy guys who follow their own interests, which is what art is supposed to do. According to Kant, for example, Kant said in the 18th century, art is the one activity that sets its own purposes, that have no use. And this is exactly what, for me, you know, what these kind of chewing gum artists do, but you also kind of provide recognition for them.
I think for me, the kind of conceptual art that I'm most attracted to, I don't know if there's a real word or phrase for it, but I call it like romantic conceptualism. So there's a sort of sense of poetry to it. My favorite work of art probably of all time is Felix González-Torres' Perfect Lovers, which if you don't know the work, it's just two standard clocks, the kind you would see in a school classroom. And if you walk up to the work, all you see is these two clocks butted up against each other, and they're set to the exact same time. And if you're just looking at it without seeing the title, you're like, what the hell am I looking at? But then when you read the title, it becomes this very romantic gesture that's like just, you know, yeah, every time, you know? So that sort of romanticism, I think, is very much a part of the subject matter. I think a lot of the artists in this show, it's weird that I refer to them as the artists in the show. It's almost like a group show I'm talking about. But a lot of them are into doing these sort of futile efforts. And like, for example, like the guy who does sand sculptures exclusively of beached whales, which again, just a silly, funny, hysterical thing to me. But the idea that eventually those will get washed away with the tide as well. And they are kind of pathetic, but also like there's an aspect to it, like that character in particular, I've always thought about him as being like a trust fund kid, like who just gets to do that because he has nothing else to worry about. I call him like a parent's worst nightmare and a daughter's like dream, you know, like, so that kind of character.
Yeah, that's so interesting because we talked about this in our conversation for the catalog about the trust fund kid aspect of this, because it is true that nowadays, if you opt for these kind of ephemeral, non-material, not opting for the unique material artwork kind of practice, you have to be rich. You have to have some sort of income that
or you're really dedicated and have a day job.
Yes.
You know, like,
and what's funny again is that you allow your conceptual artist to pursue this, how can I say, far away from the market realities practices, because, you know, you depict it and turn it into something that is a commodity. These practices are not commodifiable, but you allow them to enter the commodity sphere. So that's interesting. And the same is also true for the titles. I think that what conceptual art one of the things that conceptual art really taught us is that written statements, titles, programmatic utterances of the artist are an integral part of the artwork, are not outside. And the titles, the way they function in your work, it's very interesting because they reach into the work. They are not outside the work, they constitute the meaning of the work. They are what Jacques Derrida called this the parergon, something that is seemingly outside but actually reaches into the artwork and constitutes its meaning. And so that's why there is no way to ignore the titles, right? The titles are an integral part of the artwork and produce meaning in a way very similar to the paintings and how they produce meaning.
Yeah, I think the titles, I've always been obsessed with titles. I don't think I've untitled maybe a handful of things in my entire career because I think it's such an important sort of side note or a clue for somebody.
I'm obsessed with titles.
Me too. I love a good title, even when it comes to not art, you know. But anyway, so giving people that clue, one of my favorite things to do is if I'm like luckily not recognizable too often because I don't go out much. So if I go to like my own show and like watch people like approach the painting without looking at the title, I love watching the reaction of them just being like, what the hell is happening in this painting? Like, why is this guy holding a pumpkin with the shape like his own head? You know, like, it's these kind of reactions that I live for on a daily basis. But yeah, it's, I forgot what the point was of that conversation, but like, yeah, I forgot what the question was.
It was actually more a remark. So maybe we can just continue because I think that what's also very interesting about the figures that appear in your paintings is that they are definitely not painted as suggesting individuality. They are stand-ins. They are stereotypes. They all have a very similar facial how do you call it?
Characteristics.
Yes, characteristics. And, you know, they remind me a bit the models, male models from the 90s, like how Hedi Slimane liked them. So it's not about someone, it's about an abstraction, clearly. And maybe we can talk about that because I think, on the one hand, each conceptualist is very specific and engaged in a very specific activity, but then they are completely exchangeable and have no individuality, but have these kind of standard features. So maybe we can talk about that.
I basically, it's almost like central casting. I think of all of them as just being Holden Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye. Like, it could just be, any single one of them could be that person. But the other thing with the conceptual aspect of it is, one thing I realized, and a friend of mine joked with me about it when I was working on this series, she's mentioned to me that like in art school, like college art school, the kids who could get away with everything were like the hot guys. Like, if they were like attractive, they could like get away with the stupidest conceptual work and everyone would just fawn over them. Like, and so that wasn't lost on me with this series, that like, yes, the figures tend to be, at least to some people's taste, like attractive, you know. So it wasn't lost on me that aspect of the work, while people tend to focus on that part of the work a lot more than what's happening, which kind of gets annoying after a while. It's like, oh, like Hernan paints pretty boys. It's like, well, do you know what he's doing in that painting? It's a lot more interesting than the pretty boy, you know? So I think people hopefully are more interested in just, you know, a pretty face, you know?
Yeah, and if the pretty face repeats itself and becomes obviously a stereotype, then you focus more on the other details of the painting. I mean, that's basically there's a kind of shift happening when looking at them because you recognize familiar features and then you focus on everything else.
It happens in fashion even too. I mean, if you look at a runway show, they're basically walking mannequins. I mean, it doesn't really matter because the point is the clothing at the end of the day. So what you should be looking at is the clothing, not like the faces necessarily. So marching out a bunch of people who look Hedi Slimane typical, you know?
It depends on the
you know?
fashion
Designer,
show though, because, you know, Balenciaga has opted since a couple of years for characteristic models
Right, yeah.
that have these
Boring.
non-conventional looks. Yeah, we can talk about this another time.
Yeah.
But I think also another thing that struck me when looking at the show here, and we did touch on that a bit when we talked first, is I would maybe call it claustrophobic character of these interiors that we see here, because we see interiors, often studios or studio type situations with no windows. And if they are windows, they are having blinds. The outside world is kept outside. The outside world doesn't come in, it's claustrophobically basically not allowed in. Whereas when you think of traditional paintings that depict studio scenes, say Courbet's Atelier du Peintre, Courbet reunited his whole entourage. There was Baudelaire, the critic, there was his collectors, there was the model, there was a whole social universe, as if Courbet told us at the time, this social universe is what enables my practice. I am them. I'm only possible because I'm part of this formation. Whereas in your case, and this is also true for the self-portrait, in quotation marks, toward the end of the show, the figures are lonely, they are disconnected, and the social realities are kept out. Why is that?
Well, most of you know me well enough to know that I do not have an entourage. So, in my own life, you wrote a book about friendship. I couldn't fill a room with that many people to do that kind of painting, surrounded by friends. So, for me, people like to say that the painting that they look lonely, but I just think of them as being the same as me. I'm really content in the studio alone. I would be more discontent if there was tons of people around me in the studio. Some people like that sort of environment where tons of people are working around you. I want to be left alone as much as humanly possible. It's a completely different.
One sees that, and what maybe, it's very interesting because another thing that echoed through my mind when I looked at your show, I thought, many of these paintings, it's as if the death drive, Freud's death drive, was running through them. It's, there are lots of gravestones. There's a kind of morbid atmosphere at times, or at least a melancholic atmosphere, and I wondered whether the paintings seem to kind of prepare with this kind of morbidity for a time where they will exist, how can I say it, posthumously, like when you will be dead.
Right.
And this is somewhat acknowledged, the possibility of the death of the artist and the possibility of a posthumous existence and circulation of these paintings is acknowledged due to this death drive that seems to run through them. Am I on the right track?
Yeah, I'm definitely drawn towards dark humor in general, as a human. But I think for me, people are surprised when I say this, but one of the artists I was looking at the most for this series when I was working on it was Andy Warhol and the Death and Disaster series. And
I can see that.
Yeah.
Warhol is anyhow.
Yeah, exactly.
Completely the subtext of many of these paintings.
So a lot of the things that interest these artists obviously come out of my own interest because I'm, the one making them up. So it's kind of natural that, I overlap a little bit, even though they're not self-portraits. But even in the course of doing the show, there were moments of dark humor that I thought I was this close to being a little over the board, Like the one painting, for example, I had to confer with my friend on the phone for 2 days straight, should I do this painting?
So there is a friend.
Yeah, well, there's a friend. I do have friends, but it was, I call it the Milk Carton Kids painting. It's not titled that, but it's the character, the artist, photographs himself with a Polaroid whenever he's feeling.
Oh, that's a sad one. And
whenever he's feeling lonely.
In the back, there's the fridge with the milks.
Yeah.
I love that painting.
So he puts
it's
the
so
Polaroid.
Warholian.
Yeah. So he puts a Polaroid of himself in the fridge and tapes it to a milk carton for someone else to find later. And I thought, okay, well, this is a sensitive subject. Milk carton kids, if you're not familiar, in the 80s, I'm sure most of you know, to put, missing children faces on milk cartons. And growing up for me, it was traumatic because you're sitting at the breakfast table and you're looking at a kid missing and you're like, I'm next, it was a traumatic thing for me. But it was such a sensitive subject that I was really on the verge of not not making that painting for a while, but what you call it, even in the painting, like I was an homage to Warhol too, like he's wearing the Warhol skull socks in the painting, like I'm wearing some Warhol socks right now.
Yeah.
But, and that was kind of an accident too, because I used myself as a model sometimes for a certain pose or something that I can't figure out for a drawing. So I photographed myself for that painting, changed the head obviously, and thin myself out a little bit. But, but I happened to be wearing those same Warhol socks with the skulls on them, and I was like, well, that's kind of perfect, you know, for that painting. Like,
yeah.
yeah.
No, great. Because I also thought, when we come now more to the kind of painterly quality of these paintings, I was also interested in the use of color in them. For instance, in many of the paintings, you depict aluminium foil in a very, how can I say, thick and material way. And that is, first of all, of course, again, a homage to Warhol's Silver Studio,
right.
Silver Factory, but there also seems to be a kind of preoccupation with like very pastos painting coverage, and then there are other moments in the paintings, like when the milk gets depicted in the fridge. It's very, very pop and
right.
very Warholian. So I was thinking whether there's maybe a whole other proposition that is latent to the conceptualist, which is me, Hernan Bas, as a painter, I can use color in all these ways, and I can paint in this material fashion, and this is maybe why painting at the end of the day triumphs over conceptual art, via color, via paint. Is that maybe that you kind of demonstrate, how can I say, capacity that painting has, that conceptual art practices often lack because they don't have this whole repertory?
Well, as a painter, I'm not going to disagree with you, but but generally speaking, I think a lot of the aspects of my work, like, that don't get discussed much is the actual paintings themselves, like the physical painting. And once I actually figure out what I'm going to paint, what this character is going to be making, what he's going to be doing, what he's going to be up to in this painting, that's the hardest part for me. Like, the fun part is when I'm actually making the paintings, yeah. Because I love trying new techniques. I like trying things that I haven't done before, because that makes me excited about the work again. Otherwise, I just get bored. So like for the aluminum foil, for example, like I love that people think it's just aluminum foil paste, like stamp paste, collaged onto the canvas.
Which it's not.
It's not.
It's painted, obviously.
It's like I put on like a thick layer of a paint medium, and then I crumple aluminum foil, stamp it into that paint, let it sit for 3 days, peel it off, and then I silver leaf it after the fact to make it look like aluminum foil, which is a lot of steps for something that you could have just collaged aluminum foil onto. But I have a weird stickler for like having every single thing on painting be paint.
Yeah. No, that's very obvious, and you know, the work is obviously very labor intensive, and since all the conceptual artists, or most of them, are visited in their studio, I was also wondering if this work is not about artistic labor and its specificity, which is something that happens traditionally in the artist's studio. Because, you know, many theorists have proposed, like art theorists, sociologists, in the last years, they proposed that artistic labor has become more and more similar to general labor. Artists operate like managers, artists perform themselves, they have to be these flexible neoliberal subjects. So the difference between artistic labor and general labor has minimized, and the same is true in the labor sphere. Like a normal worker nowadays is also expected to be creative like an artist. So there are all these overlaps between artistic labor and general labor that have increased during the last years. At the same time, there is something specific about artistic labor. It's more privileged, it can set its own goals, it can decide upon what it wants to do, and it can also decide upon its outcome. Maybe there are some stressful factors, like an art fair, that has to be, you know, a deadline. But compared to someone working, say, in an advertising agency, I think artist workers have still more liberties and privileges. And I feel that this is also what this series is about. It's an homage to artistic labor and its specificity in the studio. It's insisting on the difference between artistic labor and general labor, reminding us that it's not exactly the same, even though it might overlap occasionally.
Right. I've always said that I think that all of these characters would still be doing what they're doing in the paintings, whether they were being paid for it or whether anyone had even ever seen it before. And I think that was an important aspect for me within this series and the characters that I was working on. The idea that even the way that they're photographed, the way they're visualized within the paintings, to me reminded me of the sort of photography you see in like some hipster magazine that a photographer's hired to follow this artist around and shoot him in the studio. And another reason people were like, oh, why do they always look kind of annoyed? You know, it's because I hate being photographed in the studio too. And like that look is very familiar to me, that like, oh God, you know, like that kind of attitude, I think, comes across.
This stare, this terrified stare, right?
The stare, and also just the fact that they're intruding on your space as well. Like, and also a lot of what they're doing are sort of intimate moments, like the guy dripping paint into a puddle in the middle of a field. If he was doing that by himself, it's a very different world. You know, and to have someone photographing you or spying on you or just even catching you in the act in a way, I think conjures that kind of attitude in a lot of the characters.
Yeah, it's insisting, the conceptualists insist on their right to be very idiosyncratic and to do things that make no sense and that are maybe also unsellable. But I also was thinking about, you know, we talked about the look on their faces, this kind of dandyish, vigorous. What struck me, and we've talked about this, is none of them identifies as a woman. You know, only in your self-portrait, women are allowed in, but rather indirectly in the form of books. We have one book by Sylvia Plath, Bell Jar, and then there's a catalog by Anna Mendieta that also sits on the table. So there are women producers who enter your rather male world via books, but other than that, even the audience in the painting which depicts the pillow fight tournament, even the pillow fight tournament, which is one of the few paintings that allows for an audience, is only male. Right. So why is that? Why are women kind of playing such a, how can I say, minor role in the world of the conceptualists?
I think they pop in if you sort of know about art, I guess you could say. Like there's the painting that is inspired by the Anna Mendieta Silhouetta series, the guy lying who pours blood into snow and makes snow devils, you know. So that's like sort of an obvious reference to her as well. But I don't know, it's one of those questions people ask me, like, why don't you paint women? It's like, well, why don't you? You know, I don't know, it's just like...
I write about them.
Yeah. I don't know, it's just one of those things. I forgot what the other part of the question was.
Oh, that's the main part.
Yeah. I don't know, it's a question I still don't know the answer to. I mean, it's also, there's so much talk about representation and how much responsibility artists should have in representing other people who aren't. I don't know that it's my personal responsibility to do that. Like, if I started painting like African American figures, I would be confused too. You know, like I don't think it's appropriate. Like I can't speak to that voice. Like it has nothing to do with me. Like, and you know, people say, oh, it's just a bunch of white boys. Like, well, like I'm not white for starters. Like I'm Hispanic. Like I'm also gay. Like there's plenty of voices to go around within that. You know, like so. I feel like I give myself enough leeway to just sort of get away with whatever I want at this point. Like.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. It's not that, like, because I'm read as a woman, I feel left out. I mean, it's not that I want to see myself in a work of art and that I reject it if I don't find myself in it. Of course not. I just think, like, maybe from a psychoanalytic point of view, it's maybe somewhat symptomatic for something that it's such a male world. Right. And it's just something, you know, of course people will notice that. Yeah. Because, for instance, the audience of the pillow fight, they could consist of others as well, you know, but you're very, very consistent.
The pillow fight painting, for example, my brother lives next door to my studio. And when I finished that painting, I'll never forget that day. He walked into the studio and he looked at it and he said, "This is the gayest painting you've ever made in your entire life." And he was like, I was like, "Oh, okay," you know. Like, and he's seen most of them, you know. But again, I like that idea within that painting of it being all men, because if you think about the cliches like Fight Club or something, where it is like just sort of male bravado, like dudes getting together. It's the same idea, but they're pillow fighting, you know?
It's so
I
soft.
wanted to, yeah, it's still soft, you know, so.
Yeah, no, I agree, I get that. I mean, what also is interesting regarding conventions of how artists perform themselves, I think these conventions are also somewhat thematized in the Conceptualist. And I have personally observed a weird change that happened possibly in the last 10 years. Like, I remember in the 80s, 90s, and even 2000s, it was considered absolutely cringe if an artist would allow a photographer to photograph them in their studio next to their work. This was absolutely to be avoided. Cool artists avoided that. But since a couple of years, like I remember the last Venice Biennial, I get emails from gallerists and they send me images of their artists in the Venice Biennial smiling happily next to their work. And it's like not cringe anymore. I mean, I still find it cringe, but somehow it's a convention. It has to do, of course, with social media. It has to do with Instagram. It has to do with a whole new set of, how can I say, constraints that, that make it seem normal that artists kind of perform themselves in this way. And your conceptualists, while they have this kind of terrified stare and their, you know, their faces are exchangeable, they all pose next to their work. Is that a hint to this new convention that I just talked about?
I think there's pressure with especially younger artists, like to have this sort of stage or performance or persona that's public. And I'm not obviously particularly drawn to that idea. And I mean, if you even think about like others, I mean, George Clooney's doing coffee commercials. That would, you know, actors used to not do commercials. If they did it in Japan where no one could see it, you know. So there was always a distance there. And I grew up with that mentality of like, no, you know. Also the fact that I don't like other people around. But, but aside from that, yeah, there is a lot of artists today. I think there might be a painter, but you can still say it's performance-based because they're performing being an artist. Like, and that's a weird phenomenon, and I don't quite understand it like myself, but I think it is a thing. Like, I hate Instagram personally, but like all these things that I just don't feel help the work, talk about the work, it's just superfluous to me.
Yeah, but it's funny that you allow your conceptualists to do it, that which you don't want to do. And
it's not me, it's them.
Exactly, it's them. But then it's also you, and maybe we can talk about the last painting in the show, the self-portrait of the artist who exclusively paints conceptual artists, which didn't exist when we had our first conversation. And I was very, very interested in it because, first of all, you demonstrate I'm one of them. As I said before, I'm not above them. I'm obsessed in a similar way. And the painting is also reuniting like all the kind of visual and painterly rhetorics of the other paintings. You know, a lot of things like aluminium foil again. Then there is there are kind of Warhol hints. Then there's a can which says great value, which for me points to the market successful possibilities of painting. Then there's a gravestone, again this morbid quality. Then there's a cup with Niagara Falls written on it. The artist that represents you is wearing a sweatshirt saying Kenneth Anger, Scorpio Rising. Again, you know, pointing to a certain aesthetic sensibility that is yours. And there are brushes in a bucket. You wear Converse, as always, as many of the conceptualists do. So it's basically, it's as if you were saying, I'm one of us. There's a very nice Kippenberger painting called einer von euch, one of us, that it reminded me, one of you, but I'm still alone. Because again, I thought, you know, Joan Jonas recently said, we don't come out of nothing. And she pointed to how the 60s and 70s made her. But you are made by your own reference system in that painting. That's very interesting. It's like you are made by what you do.
That painting for me was meant to be sort of, I wanted it to be at the end of the exhibition in the way that it's almost like, for me, I always thought of it as being the moment in The Wizard of Oz when they pull the curtain back and,
and the truth comes out
all the time. You know? So he's sort of the wizard, I guess, in a way, for me. So if you look at the painting, I wanted it to be like a Where's Waldo, basically. So you can catch references to every single one of the other paintings in the show within that painting, whether it's subtle or whether it's a literal representation of a study from one of the paintings. So I like that idea of the sort of a Where's Waldo. And it's just such a, I hate the word meta, but that painting just kept thinking like, oh, meta, because I could have made that painting 10 times over. Like, it could have been a conceptual artist who exclusively makes paintings of conceptual artists, who makes paintings of an artist who makes paintings of conceptual artists, who only makes paintings of conceptual artists. So that could have been, I could have made that painting 10 times over with the same title and just overlapped it like an infinity mirror, you know?
And it's also the only one which is a triptychon.
Yeah.
It's a triptychon, you know, it's which implies an expansion, you know, as well.
And I like the idea of it being panoramic for like cinema's perspective as well. And I don't consider it a self-portrait, but I did use myself as the figure's model for it. And I was actually wearing this sweatshirt in the painting, or in this photo, which is another Kenneth Anger movie called Lucifer Rising. But I was originally going to use that, but I thought if you don't know who Kenneth Anger is and you just see Lucifer written with a rainbow, it might be too confusing for the audience, so I picked another Kenneth Anger movie just to calm people down, because, you know, Lucifer, you know. But, what do you call it? So, another one of those accidents that happen, like the socks, you know, in the studio all the time. But yeah.
It's so funny that I might say that now. I used that image by Sturtevant for the cover of my friendship book, just as an aside. But, you know, I was also thinking about the decision you made for installing the work in an art fair booth style. You know, there are all these booth situations and each wall is used for a painting. It's like in an art fair where you don't leave a wall empty because you can't afford it. And we now come back to the beginning of our conversation, because I think, again, the kind of market potential of these paintings that circulate in the value sphere is acknowledged, and at the same time the conceptual practices that we see there, which have no such potential or very little potential in comparison, are allowed in, also dragged into this art fair vibe. Right. And also it's kind of, it changes the way one looks at things. If you enter a booth, there's always something behind you, something, and it's, how can I say, it's maybe less museal, it's more like, art fairish. So, but maybe you can talk about that decision.
When I was trying to figure out how to lay out the show, it's kind of a difficult space because it's a very long, especially for painting. It's great for sculpture, but it's a very long, very tall space. And so when I thought about it for a while, I realized, like, well, let's just talk about the elephant in the room, because it was opening during the art fair in Miami, which is like the only reason people see art half the time in Miami, you know, at least out of towners, at least, and everything. But so I like the idea of calling out the elephant in the room and designing it in that same sort of format with the long hallway. And but also at the same time, when I discussed it with James, he also pointed out to me that it reminded him of graduate school studio spaces. So I also love that idea, because it's like you're doing studio visits with each of these kids, you know? So I like that aspect of it, too.
And that's interesting. I saw them as studio visit paintings, you know, like each is a studio visit,
I came this close to requesting like a champagne cart, like going. But I thought that was the overkill, probably. But but you know, you don't have to beat a dead horse, as they say. Yeah, I think the idea was there, pretty visible. But
Yeah.
yeah, and also I just like that idea of if someone had just come from the fair and they walk into that space, they're like, why is this familiar? This is a weird feeling, like you're looking down the hall to see like, oh, is there someone important over there? You know?
So are you pointing to the structural similarities between a formerly non-market implicated museum sphere and the commercial sphere? And we all know that the absolute divide that existed between these spheres, say 50 years ago, does not exist anymore.
Right.
Are you pointing to that?
I think I'm pointing to it, but it's not something that I'm obsessing about because it doesn't truly concern me all that much, to be honest.
Yeah.
I can say that luckily because I've had like a 25-year career and now I can get away with a lot more. But it's all present there, but I didn't want it to become an overwhelming critique of anything. Like, I mean, I also considered putting like blank sort of placards on the top of each wall. Like, you know how you have the gallery names on each one, but I thought, again, overkill. It's
Yeah, that's overkill. I agree.
Doesn't need it, you know?
No, it's enough. I mean, you immediately think of an art fair, or I agree with James, it's also like a graduate show, or and booths where students show their experimental work, and that's also what it is in a way. It's allowing for this kind of openness as well, because most of these practices make no immediate sense.
Right. Yeah. I think they don't make sense, but one thing I did discover just in doing the work was how much, especially during their fair, when I met people who were coming from not necessarily the US, I realized how American the subject matter is, because a lot of people were like, what are you talking about? You know, like if you're coming from Europe or something, like they were very confused by, for example, the pumpkin painting with the guy holding the pumpkin. I had to describe like these pumpkin molds that actually exist. Like you put a pumpkin in this mold and it grows into the shape, and you take the mold off and it's, you know, they sell Trump head ones now. You know, but like, you know, it's a real thing. But if you're not American, you don't understand the idea of even why that would exist as a thing, you know. So, and milk carton kids, another very American thing. Like, so I didn't realize how American the subject matter. And
I think it's also, it's like the American occult. And that is something that also me, as someone who comes from Germany, I'm not so familiar with. I mean, but I am interested in the fact that you are drawn to the occult so much, because I think the occult, what does it imply? It implies a non-Western knowledge, it implies irrational practices, and it implies maybe a critique of Western rationality. So in that way, it's really important. On the other hand, the occult is also something people are drawn to if they flight from the unbearability of social conditions. If social conditions become very unbearable, you seek for esoteric occult practices, you seek help there. And this is currently happening a lot. I mean, you know, you can see it online and everywhere that people are very attracted by the occult, but because maybe social conditions have become so unbearable that we seek help elsewhere. Of course, what this implies as well is that we don't try to analyze our social conditions, but we opt for a flight into the occult instead. Right. And me, as someone who likes sociology and who's interested in analyzing social conditions, I'm always like, no, I rather want to understand society than opting for the occult. What's your take?
I think historically it's always been, the occult has always taken a rise when things are bad out, I guess you could say.
Yes.
Like the whole birth of spiritualism started after the war, you know, World War II. Like it all
World War I.
Yeah.
Lebensreform
Exactly.
in Europe,
So if you think about that and the rise of it in the last couple of, like, may say 20 years or so, I mean, you can't turn on the TV now without there being some kind of ghost hunter show or Bigfoot show, where I watch them all the time in my studio. I stopped watching the Bigfoot ones because they never find them. You know, it's just like a bunch of guys yelling in the woods to themselves. It's just like, it's not good television. But for me, I think the whole idea of the occult is you have to have such belief, like the Bigfoot hunters. It's all about belief. And I think, I was thinking about this the other day, like where the church has gotten one thing, they've done one thing really well, and that's built a structure that has such devotion and such belief that you can make the most amazing sculpture, Michelangelo's David, but to millions of people, a dime-star Virgin Mary statue is more interesting and more important to them, and will always be more important to them. They did their job in getting those people to believe that, you know? So it's impressive in that sense. So that sort of belief system is something I think is tied directly to the occult. Like most people who believe that heavily in like UFOs and stuff, it becomes a cult to some extent.
But couldn't one say the same thing about the art system? It's also a belief system.
Yeah, you have to believe.
It's also about believing in art as having symbolic value.
Right.
And it's also a bit like a cult, all the rituals, or, you know.
Well, even within the work, a lot of the work that the artists are making in the show are ritualistic as well. Yes. So it sort of ties into that aspect, I think, too. Which, yeah, I don't practice any particular culty, you know.
Good to know.
You know, like, I don't have time for that, you know. But maybe when I retire. But I'll pick up Santeria. But no. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, great. I think maybe we talked enough. Maybe it's time for questions, because I can imagine that there are lots of questions in the audience. So there's a mic, I guess. Lots of energetic arms.
Thank you so much for coming today. And I never found myself laughing so much as I was going through the exhibit, which was really wonderful. I'm a writer, and so I was really interested in the process that you take to coming up with the words that you include with the images. And if you know what you're going to write beforehand, before you paint, or how much you modify it afterwards.
I always, with this series in particular, I just started with lists and lists and lists, basically, and it could just be like a word, like magnetism, or, you know, like just random, like fossils, you know, like just random words. Like I just keep notes on my iPhone, like just scrolling through it all the time, adding things. I'll wake up in the middle of the night, I'll add something, I'll wake up in the morning, I'll be like, what does cat burglar have to do with conceptual art, you know? So all these weird, like, things, but, so I start with lists, basically, at first, of titles, and they're loose titles, and by the time I actually make, so that gives me the basic idea for the painting, I'll make the painting, and then the hardest part is actually, as a writer, you know, making that phrase exact and perfect and concise and short enough, because I don't want to have like a paragraph for a title. Some of them verged on paragraphs, but I wanted it to be as concise as possible. So I think the title was almost almost harder in some cases than actually making the paintings to get them right. Like, and I'm also a stickler, so like it was very important to me to have the titles be perfect, or at least perfect for me, you know. You know.
Hi, thank you so much. I loved the playfulness of the work and the beauty of the work.
Thanks.
I noticed that a lot of the paintings were from last year, so I was impressed also by your productivity. So maybe you could talk a little bit about your process. Are you working on one painting at a time, or do you have multiple paintings going? How do you work on them day to day?
This is the longest series I have ever worked on consistently. I think I started this series 2.5 years ago. Usually a series for me lasts 6 to 8 months max, because I'd get so bored of it. You know? But this series really just like took off, and I just couldn't I kept adding to the list, and it was such a fruitful idea for me, and in a way for me to run away with so many different characters that I just stuck to it for much longer than I usually do. To be honest, I'm really sick of it right now. like I quit making the Conceptualists last December, and I've moved on to another series, but so it's funny to talk about it again. I'm like, oh God. But as an artist or even a writer, you know, when you write a book,
yeah. And
you publish it, then you have to go back and do press for it. You don't want to talk about this anymore.
And also and you don't even feel it's you who wrote it.
Yeah.
You're like, who wrote this?
I have a distance to this work already.
I know
I'm like,
the feeling.
Oh God, not that again. And you should feel that way as an artist. Like you should want to move on immediately. Like I think
agree.
that's not a bad thing. Oh, but the question was my day-to-day. Was that the question? It's more my studio practice. I don't typically work on more than one painting at a time. I think I like to have an idea and finish it. It's just done, you know. I can think about and research other paintings while I'm making a painting, but I definitely work one at a time. I think, was that another part of the question, or did I miss anything? What's that? Okay.
There's a question here.
Probably really don't need a mic. Obviously, you love piercing blue eyes. But when you start a painting, do you have the full concept in mind, or is it a vague concept that you keep adding elements to until all of a sudden you say, now I'm done?
It's a mix of both in a way. I like to have visual clues, especially with these kind of works where you have to sort of break apart what's happening narratively. The funny thing you mentioned with the blue eyes, I usually do blue or green because for me, when you see a painting, it's typically the only one you're seeing at a time. And the blue and green just pop in a way that draws you in as a painter. When I first hung this show and I walked down the aisle and I made the paintings hang a certain way where when you're walking this way, they're all looking at you like this. And then when you're walking the other direction, they're looking at you like this, you know. And when I first did that, I was freaked out. I was like, all these eyes on me, they're all blue, you know. Like it had a weird effect on me because I'm not used to seeing 35 paintings at the same time together, ever. You know, I think that's the most I've ever shown one large body of work, I think, ever. So that was a little jarring for myself. But I did try to throw in a few brown and black eyes, but like, you know. But yeah, but generally, like, I think I work out the kinks and the layout a lot of the time in drawings prior to the paintings, which I forgot to mention. I do a lot of preliminary drawings, especially for the larger paintings, because I have to figure out the composition and stuff. Like the absinthe painting, like there's a work on paper that's the exact same size as the painting, which is kind of, you know, why did you go through all that labor? But it gives me a way to work out all the kinks and all the layouts, all the compositions. I know it sounds dumb to say it because obviously any artist should think about this, but I'm really obsessed with composition, you know, as you should be. So that kind of stuff is really important to me, and like even like the placement of a can, or like, you know, especially that last giant painting, like having to figure out how to put all the elements from the different paintings into one, like again, I made a giant drawing of that painting before I made the painting, just to figure out where to put everything. Like, so it's a lot of labor that
It's
some
like
people
your
think is
alphabet.
unnecessary, but
that painting is really like your alphabet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, Bear.
You worked in Detroit. Most of your work has been here, Detroit. Any other place?
Like where I've had a studio, you mean?
Yeah.
No, I abandoned Detroit as of almost 2 years now. So I'm full-time back in Miami. It was a kind of a pleasure to have two studios, but then after a while I realized, like, oh, where's that brush that I really like? Oh, it's 3,000 miles away. Like, so it's like, oh, poor Hernan has two studios, you know. But yes.
So I was just curious, what's your take on the artist in Miami, life as an artist in Miami? And how do you see it? I mean, of all the places in the world you could work, why do you come back here? And do you know other artists here, and what is their condition? And what's your relationship to that situation?
I've kind of ducked out of the scene a while ago. Like my, I guess you could call it my generation. A lot of us took off as well. Like a lot of people from my age group went to LA, or, you know, did the jump to New York and stuff. So in a way, that sort of generation kind of become a lost one in Miami. I guess it's a weird way to think of it, but it kind of feels that way a lot of the time. I feel like I'm one of the only ones left, you know, from that original group, from my age group, I guess you could say. So I don't really know what's happening in terms of the young kids, the 20-year-olds, you know, in Miami, like what they're up to. I know they're out there, and like, you know, I meet them because a lot of the times they're art handlers who come to the studio, and like I get to talk to them about what they do when they're there. But that's about as much interaction as I have, to be honest, with that generation. Even within the gallery system in Miami, like I don't really know what's happening with a lot of them. Like it's strange. And why I picked Miami? Well, I grew up here for starters, but also one of the reasons I think I was able to be as successful as I am is that I was able to avoid a lot of the trappings of chasing success. And Miami offered me sort of a cocoon to not have to deal with all of that. I could just make work here and not be worried about, oh, you know, Joe Schmo is having a show down the street at this gallery, and this guy's having a show at this gallery, and I'm jealous, you know, like I didn't care, you know? And so sort of be able to have that bubble really helped me, I think, when I was younger, to not have the pressures of the art world, I guess you could say. Like, you know, my education in art was like the library and working at the Rebelle collection when I was a kid, you know? Like, that was like my education in art. Like, so it's like, that's very different than most people's experiences, and I think I'm pretty fortunate to have had that.
We say that you were mostly investigating art than working.
You like to remind me of that, yes. But you did have a library, and the office happened to be adjacent to it. So I did do a lot of research there, but I couldn't afford a library of books at the time. So yeah, so. Yeah.
One more question?
Hey, Hernan.
Hey, Erica.
Hey. So we know you as a painter. I'm just curious to know if you've ever sort of fantasized or contemplated. There's these extensive narratives in your paintings, going into film or creating films or any other medium.
My sort of wildest dream with this project was, I'll start with this. The sort of one of the inspiration points for this series was watching an episode of the series called Documentary Now, which is, if you've seen it, these sort of mockumentaries that are written by, you know, comedians and are good writers. And there was a famous one, I forgot what the title of it was, but it was basically making fun of Marina Abramovich's The Artist is Present. And it was one of the funniest things I'd ever seen. Like, what's her name? Who plays her? Cate Blanchett plays her. And it's, if you haven't seen it, Google it immediately. It's one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my entire life. So in my head, I can imagine almost any of these characters could be 15-minute short versions of Documentary Now style, like as if they're following these artists. Like, so I thought about that for a while. Like, I didn't pursue it, obviously, for many, many reasons. But I do see them as being like very cinematic, like in that sense, where these characters can easily become. The other thing is that I had to sort of pick the top moment for each character's like greatest hits, I guess you could say, because I became so obsessed with some of these characters. I thought about entire bodies of work for each one of them, but I had to pick like one piece, let's say, you know, that they make. Like the guy who's like obsessed with discomfort. Like I thought about all these different ways you can like make people uncomfortable. Like he goes to the grocery store with like a giant thing of pennies to pay for it, you know. He just stands in the grocery store and just squeezes fruit until somebody tells him to stop, you know, as a performance. And so I like you could run with these ideas in so many different ways that I had to sort of stop myself and pick like, you know, the moment that should define this artist in a way. Like, yeah. Yes.
One more? Oh, two more. Is that okay, James? Two more, okay. Three more.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm just wondering why you chose Detroit to live in.
The short and easy answer is my partner of like 20 years like grew up there, so like I would go and visit his friends and family, and on a whim when I was there over a decade ago, I looked at like the real estate and was like, I can get a size of a studio, what, you know? So it was more basically about that, like, but similar to my experience in Miami, like I don't really leave the studio, so it could really be anywhere that I could work almost anywhere if I like the space and the environment, and that's kind of all I need, you know. So yeah, Detroit's weird, but it's worth a visit, you know.
There's someone here?
Over here, yeah. I'm just wondering, you became an artist, you were drawn to it because you saw you had a talent in the mechanical aspect of painting, and then as you evolved, like what pleasure do you get from painting? Where does the pleasure?
That's not loaded at all.
I mean, I just, because people think of, you know, a doctor, a lawyer, a candlestick maker, whatever, but I'm just wondering how one evolves into a painter, and when you do these series, what's the pleasure you're getting? I mean, do you set out with a concept, a goal? Is it pleasure, just the physical act of doing it?
The physical act can be enjoyable because it's like the plasticity of it is fun to me, but I think for me, all of my work sort of stems from just basic curiosity and finding things that I find are really strange and interesting, and I get so excited that I want to share that with people. So the joy I get out of it, I think the most is like, if you Google something really strange, and one of my paintings pops up, I'm like so happy. Like that to me is like one of the goals in my life, like to have the Encyclopedia of the Strange be like one of my paintings when it pops up, you know. It's a weird thing to obsess over, like your Google search, not Google searching my name, but like, you know, if you Google search mold of pumpkin head painting. It's gonna be me, you know, because there's not another one out there, you know. So that aspect gives me joy, I guess you could say, in a Marie Kondo kind of way. But yeah.
There's another question here, and another one.
Hi, sorry. So everything you do is extremely mindful. I noticed that every part of your paintings, from the title to the composition, the color, everything is extremely thought out. Within that, this is more of a technical question. There are parts within your painting that are so extremely intensively rendered, labor intensively rendered.
Right.
And then there are parts, small itty bitty moments where there's, you called it flat or pop. To me, technically, it's flat because you go from this extreme, almost chiaroscuro rendering to this pop, flat, what print, perhaps even, aesthetic. And I'm just curious, what is the thought process behind that? I'm sure there is one, as everything is so intentional in what you do. So I was wondering, what is the intentionality between that vocabulary of painting?
You mentioned Joan Jonas earlier, like we don't come from nothing. Like for me, I like to be inspired by so many things that it becomes like a massive mixtape where you can't exactly pinpoint, oh, it's just, he's really into this one person. I want you to be able to say, he's into a lot of people's work, you know? And that sort of collage of influence I think is really important to me. The techniques have become a little more specific, like you mentioned, like more than ever. I get really obsessive about almost to the point of photorealism with some things lately, which I've never been interested in before. For example, the painting with the silhouettes with the blood. Like, I obsessed over those, like painting a gallon of stage blood. It was Easter morning, actually, almost a year ago. And I'm sitting there on Easter morning, I'm like, I'm spending Easter painting a gallon of stage blood, you know, like what does my life come to? So, but I wanted it to be so specific because like it was such an important part of the painting, like the stage blood color had to be the exact color, like all these, you know, so I get a little OCD, honestly, about certain things. But then I also get really lazy at certain things and think that's enough information, you don't need to spell it out. Like, I could have sat there and hand painted each one of the milk carton, you know, labels, but I'm like, well, just make a silk screen, you know? It's the same thing. So like, there's a play between those two aspects of my work. Like, I think that I struggle with even within myself, like, why are you spending like 3 days on a gallon of milk and then 1 day on just snow, you know? So it's a constant struggle for me to sort of balance that out, but that again gives me joy, you know? So, yeah.
So,
thank you all so much for
Yeah.
coming, and
Thank
thanks
you.
for Elizabeth for coming as well.